Welcome to today's video, where we will be delving deep into the dark and tragic period known as the Middle Passage of the Atlantic slave trade. Brace yourselves, for we will be exploring the horrors that took place during this time, a time when human beings were treated as nothing more than mere commodities to be bought, sold, and traded. Imagine being crammed into a tiny, disease-ridden space with hundreds of other people, with barely enough room to move or breathe. Imagine being forced to lie in your own filth, with no access to proper food or water. Imagine being subjected to beatings, whippings, and torture, with no hope of escape. It's difficult to even fathom the horrors that these men, women, and children endured during the Middle Passage. As we delve deeper into this dark period of history, we must remember the lives that were lost, the families that were torn apart, and the lasting impact that the Middle Passage had on the world. The Middle Passage refers to the transatlantic journey that millions of enslaved Africans were forced to take from their homeland to the New World. This voyage was one of the most brutal and inhumane experiences that any human being could endure. To understand the Middle Passage, we must first understand the Atlantic slave trade. This trade involved the forced capture and transportation of Africans to the Americas to work on plantations and in mines. The slave trade started in the 15th century and lasted until the 19th century, with the largest number of enslaved Africans being transported during the 18th century. The Middle Passage was the most dangerous part of the slave trade, and it was the journey that took place between Africa and the Americas. The voyage took several weeks and sometimes months, depending on the ship's route and weather conditions. The slaves were packed tightly into the ship's hold, which was a dark, cramped, and filthy space with little air or light. The conditions were so terrible that it was common for slaves to become sick, injured, or die during the journey. The horrors of the Middle Passage were many. The first thing that strikes you is the sheer number of people crammed into a small space. Each ship could carry up to 600 slaves, and they were packed into the hold like sardines in a can. The slaves were chained together, and the only space they had to move was the few inches between each other. They were forced to lie in their own urine and feces, and the stench was unbearable. The heat was suffocating, and there was no ventilation or fresh air. African captives greatly outnumbered the slave ship crew. Therefore, slave traders devised severe regimes to maintain control. Without the use of chains and manacles, guns, and a draconian regime, the handful of sailors would have faced far more challenges from their captives. Slave ship captains and crew developed their own distinctive routines, how to marshal and control the captives, and how and when to feed and exercise them. When weather permitted, the crewmen brought batches of chained African men on deck for exercise. Even so, the Africans' experience was defined overwhelmingly by imprisonment below decks and shackled in ranks. The slaves were treated as cargo and not as human beings. They were given minimal food and water, and often not enough to sustain them for the long journey. They were forced to eat from communal bowls and had to fight for their share. The slaves were often whipped and beaten if they refused to eat or drink. Women and children were often allowed a degree of mobility compared to the bonded men. Without any legal protection, however, African women and children were without defense against crewmen who regularly abused and raped them during the voyage to the Americas. Moreover, shipboard conditions created the environment for contagious sicknesses, notably the bloody flux, which infected the captives, killing many and reducing others to a wretched state. Some individuals resisted the horrors of the Middle Passage the only way they could, through starvation and suicide. The true death rate for Africans transported to the Americas was much higher than the approximately 1 million that died during the Middle Passage. It included those who died in Africa when their communities were attacked, followed by the march to the coast, and those who died shortly after arriving in the Americas. Indeed, the Middle Passage was but one of many horrific journeys experienced by enslaved Africans along their forced migration from home to a new life of bondage in the Americas. Countless captives died along African slave routes through deserts, forests, or interior waterways before reaching European forts, castles, or barracoons on the West or Central African coast, weeks, months, or even years after their initial capture. Though the great majority of Africans survived the crossing, more than 1 million died during the Middle Passage. Many men, women, and children survivors stepped ashore weakened and often gravely ill. In the first 3 years ashore in Brazil and the Caribbean, the high death rates likely were due more to the victims' experience on the ship and in Africa than to life in the Americas. The Middle Passage did not complete the forced journey of African captives. From points of arrival in American port cities, captives were subsequently taken over land or water on lengthy passages that delivered survivors to the mines, fields, and houses of their New World owners. For many Africans who survived the Atlantic journey only to labor in harsh conditions in the Americas, perhaps it seemed that the Middle Passage never completely ended. The journey was also traumatic in other ways. Many slaves were separated from their families, and they never saw them again. The journey was a terrifying experience, and many slaves suffered from depression, anxiety, and PTSD. Some even committed suicide by jumping overboard, preferring to die than to continue living in such horrendous conditions. Of the millions of Africans loaded onto 35,000 Atlantic ships by American and European slave traders, few left personal written accounts of their ordeal. Some of their life experiences were described as entries in the voluminous commercial papers of those involved in the slave system, and are remembered mainly by the way their lives were recorded by their captors and tormentors. As a result, their stories have remained largely hidden behind the statistics. Their monetary value, their gender and age distributions, their physical condition, their health and death, and their tragic numbers. Yet we know a great deal about those who suffered upon Atlantic slave vessels and their transfer from shore to ship, their incarceration, often for months at a time, in the floating prisons on the African coast, and their daily regime in the ships during what must have seemed an interminable crossing. For week after miserable week, African captives were effectively lost at sea. They were stranded, they knew not where, and were subject to a shipboard regime designed to keep them subdued and alive until the ship made landfall in the Americas. These weeks at sea were defined by fetid holds tight-packed with people, high levels of nausea and sickness, and random and often cavalier acts of brutality, and in the case of 1 out of every 10 slave ships, outbursts of resistance and violence. Slave ships were a stew of human misery and terror. These were the defining experiences of all Africans crossing the Atlantic, for those 11 million who survived to landfall, and the million and more who did not survive. The most famous description of the Middle Passage is that of Olaudah Equiano. Equiano of the Igbo tribe in what is now modern Nigeria wrote an account of the horrors of the Middle Passage. Kidnapped and sold into slavery at the age of 11, Equiano recounted the shock of seeing white people purchase slaves in Africa, and the fear aroused by the claim that whites ate Africans or drank their blood. The few first-hand accounts that exist consistently report that the unsanitary conditions aboard ship on the longer journeys created high mortality rates, encouraged by the incidence of smallpox, eye infections, gastrointestinal disorders, and body sores. Fever and flux were the terms used to describe common causes of death during the ocean crossing, and some slaves committed suicide by refusing to eat or throwing themselves overboard. Ships sometimes reported slave rebellions, and the result became a maritime standard of even harsher and more brutal handling. Between 1517 and 1867, 12.5 million enslaved Africans were forced onto ships to begin the Middle Passage to America. About 10.7 million men, women, and children survived the journey. Of these, about 40%, mostly from Angola, landed in Brazil, where the trade continued until 1850. About 35% of enslaved Africans went to the non-Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, and a bit more than 20% were sold in Spanish colonies. About 3.5% were sent to British North America and the United States, which lay well north of the major sailing routes and where the sugar at the heart of the Atlantic mercantile economy could not be cultivated. Every national community of European merchants participated in the transatlantic slave trade. Portugal was the largest overall transporter of enslaved Africans. Great Britain became the dominant slaving power in the 18th century, accounting for about 25% of the total, including up to half of those enslaved people delivered to North America. Spain, which entered the trade directly only in the 19th century to support the belated development of sugar and coffee in Cuba, eventually accounted for about 15% of the total. The French transported about 12% of enslaved Africans. mostly to its West Indies islands during the 18th century and before the Haitian Revolution of 1791, and the Dutch less than 5%. North Americans were relatively minor players in the transatlantic slave trade, accounting for less than 3% of the total trade. Most of the North American trade was conducted by Rhode Island merchants, who exported lumber and pine resin, meat and dairy products, cider and horses to the West Indies, and returned with molasses, which they distilled into very high-proof rum. This they exported to Africa, primarily Upper Guinea and the Windward Coast, to sell for enslaved captives, which they then transported to the West Indies to sell to sugar planters for more molasses. The highest volumes of the transatlantic slave trade came in the 1700s. During this century, more than half of the total, amounting to an average of about 50,000 enslaved Africans per year, was transported, mostly from the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763 until the end of the British trade in 1807. Slightly more than half of the 388,000 enslaved Africans who landed alive in North America came through the port of Charleston, South Carolina. A burst of arrivals came through Charleston after 1800 as cotton production in the state took off, and anxious planters anticipated the end of slave imports in 1808. The Chesapeake Bay region was second, with about a third, or an estimated 130,000 men, women, and children disembarking there. Some of these enslaved people, particularly before 1700, came to North America not directly from Africa, but from the Caribbean, where Virginia planters purchased them to work in tobacco fields. As a major port city, Boston played a role in this global economic story. The first slave trade voyage from the American colonies sailed out of Massachusetts. The ship Desire left Salem in 1637, carrying Native American captives from the Pequot War to be sold as slaves in the Caribbean. When it returned up the coast with the first known Africans imported into the northern English colonies, it most likely anchored in Boston. After this documented case of enslavement, Massachusetts legalized the enslavement of Africans, Native Americans, and mixed-race people in the colony's body of liberties. Thus began the legal justification for slavery in the Massachusetts colony. The Middle Passage was a lucrative business for slave traders, and they did everything they could to maximize their profits. The slaves were seen as expendable, and they were treated as such. The ship's crew had little regard for their well-being, and they often abused and tortured them for their own entertainment. From the cramped and filthy conditions aboard the slave ships to the brutal treatment at the hands of their captors, the enslaved Africans who made this journey were subjected to unspeakable atrocities that are difficult to even imagine. And yet, it is important that we do not turn away from this history. For as painful as it may be to confront, the Middle Passage is a part of our shared human experience. It is a reminder of the darkest depths to which our species can sink, but also of the incredible resilience and strength that can emerge in the face of such adversity. As we move forward, we must remember the legacy of the Middle Passage and the countless lives that were lost and forever altered by the transatlantic slave trade. We must honor the courage and resilience of those who survived and fought for their freedom, and we must commit ourselves to building a more just and equitable world for all people. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. Do not forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.